There is an hour of the night that has no name in modern English, and it is the hour this story happens in. It is not midnight, which we treat as the middle of the night, although it rarely is. It is not the small hours, which is a phrase for wakefulness and worry. It is the last stretch before the sky begins to change, the part of the night that is coldest, quietest, and furthest from both the evening you remember and the morning you are waiting for. The night is divided into 4 watches in the world this story comes from, and that division is not poetic. It is administrative. A watch is a shift. Somebody stands, and then somebody else stands, and the night is portioned out so that a wall or a camp or a household is never unguarded. The Roman army ran on it, and by the 1st century, so did much of the eastern Mediterranean, including a lake in northern Galilee where men who fished at night would have known exactly where they were in the dark without ever looking at anything. Mark sets the hour precisely. About the 4th watch of the night he came to them walking on the sea, not in the evening, not at midnight. The 4th watch, roughly 3 in the morning until dawn, the last shift, the one nobody wants. That single detail tells you the whole shape of what had happened before it, and almost nobody notices it, because we hear the sentence as a piece of drama rather than as a piece of information. If he came in the 4th watch, then they had been out there through the 1st, the 2nd, and the 3rd. They had been on that water in the dark for the length of a working night. 4 watches divided the hours of darkness, each about 3 hours long, and the boat had been in the middle of the lake for 3 of them. It is worth pausing on the counting itself, because there were 2 systems in use, and the choice between them tells you something about who an account was written for. The older Jewish reckoning divided the night into 3 watches rather than 4, a beginning, a middle, and a morning watch. The Roman system, which came with the army and spread with it, used 4, each of about 3 hours, so that a sentry stood one shift and slept the rest. Mark uses the Roman 4. Elsewhere in his account, he even names them in the Roman order: evening, midnight, cockcrow, dawn, as a way of saying at what hour a household might be caught unready. A writer reaches for the time-keeping his readers live by. The 4th watch is not an exotic flourish. It is the way an ordinary person in the Roman world would have said 3:30 in the morning, and it would have landed on the first hearers with the flat familiarity of a shift pattern. 2 things follow from that. The first is that this is a report with a clock in it, which is not what invented stories usually contain. The second is that a listener in the 1st century, hearing 4th watch, would immediately have felt the length of what came before, the way anybody who has worked nights knows exactly what it means to hear that something happened at 4 in the morning. This is a story about the night crossing of the Sea of Galilee. Where it happened, what the water is actually like, what kind of boat they were in, how far they got, why they could not get further, and what it means that the account is so careful about the hour. Very little of this is disputed. Most of it comes from geography, from archaeology, and from the plain wording of the accounts themselves, and it is worth knowing because the familiar picture, a calm blue lake, a small boat, a figure approaching over the water, leaves out almost everything that made the night hard. To understand the crossing, you have to understand the lake, because the lake is not an ordinary body of water, and it does not behave like one. The Sea of Galilee is not a sea. It is a freshwater lake, fed by the Jordan from the north and drained by the Jordan to the south, and its character comes almost entirely from where it sits. It lies in the Jordan Rift Valley, a long geological trench running down through the region, and the land on either side of it rises steeply and quickly. The lake lies about 200 meters below the level of the sea. Think about what that means for a moment. A body of open water sitting in a hole 200 meters deep, with hills and plateaus standing above it on almost every side. The Golan Heights rise to the east, hills close in to the west. The air down at the surface is warm. The basin is sheltered and subtropical in feel, which is exactly why the fishing was good and why the shore was densely settled. It is roughly 13 miles from north to south and about 8 miles across at its widest point, which sounds small until you are in the middle of it in the dark. From the middle you can see lights on both shores. That is not a comfort. It means everybody watching from the land can see the weather coming before you can. And the weather comes down. Cold air sitting on the heights above spills into the warm basin through the valleys and wadis that cut down towards the water. And when it does, it arrives fast from above, and it arrives concentrated, funneled by the shape of the ground rather than spread out across a wide front. A lake that was flat 20 minutes ago develops a short, steep, chopping sea. It is not an ocean swell. It is worse for a small boat than an ocean swell, because the waves are close together and there is no rhythm to settle into. These squalls are still a feature of the lake and are still dangerous. Modern sailing directions for that water carry warnings about how quickly conditions change, and there are well-documented occasions in living memory when a flat afternoon turned into waves high enough to swamp small craft and drive boats onto the shore. The lake has not become gentler. It has only become better equipped with engines, forecasts, and radios. Take those away, and you have the conditions the account describes. There is a second, quieter effect of the geography that matters for a night crossing. Down in the basin, the surrounding hills cut off much of the horizon, and the wind arriving over a ridge gives very little warning at water level. No long approach across open ground, no gradual freshening. The first sign is often the water itself. For a crew already out in the middle, the decision about whether to turn back has usually been made for them before they knew there was a decision to make. Fishermen on that lake did not regard this as extraordinary. It is a normal feature of the place, and it happens most reliably in the late afternoon and at night, when the temperature difference between the heights and the basin is at its greatest. Which is to say, the worst conditions on that water occur precisely during the hours when the fishing was done. A fit crew could cross it in a couple of hours, in ordinary conditions, pulling steadily. That is the number to hold on to. This was not an expedition. It was a routine journey by men who did it constantly, in the dark, as a matter of trade. Whatever else is happening in this account, it is not happening to people who were out of their depth. Josephus commanded troops in Galilee during the revolt against Rome a generation later, and he wrote about the region in detail. The towns around the lake, the fertility of the plain on its northwestern shore, and the boats. At one point in his campaign, he assembled a fleet of local vessels on that water. So we are not guessing about the scale of things. The lake supported a working, organized commercial fishing economy, with boatyards, harbors, salting works, and enough hulls available that an army could requisition them. That is the setting. A busy lake in a deep trench with weather that falls on it from above, worked at night by professionals. In the winter of 1986, the lake fell further than anyone could remember. Years of drought and heavy pumping had drawn the water down, and along the northwestern shore, a wide band of grey mud emerged that had been underwater for a very long time. Moshe and Yuval Lufan were brothers from a kibbutz on the shore, fishermen themselves, and amateur archaeologists in the way that people who love a place often are. Walking the exposed mud, they saw the outline of something that was not stone, an oval shape, and then the faint line of nails, and then the curve of a hull lying on its side beneath the silt. What they had found was a boat from the 1st century. It had been sitting in anaerobic mud for around 2,000 years, which is why it had survived at all. Waterlogged wood does not rot when there is no oxygen to rot it, and the same mud that hid it preserved it. Getting it out was a strange and delicate operation. The wood had the consistency of wet cardboard. Lifted in the ordinary way, it would simply have come apart. So the excavators encased the whole hull in polyurethane foam, floated the resulting package along the shore, and then spent years replacing the water in the wood, molecule by molecule, with a synthetic wax so that it could dry without collapsing. The hull measured a little over 8 meters from end to end, and about 2.5 across. That is a working boat, room for a crew of 4 or 5 to row, a small deck at the stern, a mast that could carry a modest sail when the wind allowed. It could hold perhaps a dozen or 15 people if they packed in and the water was flat. It is the size of thing you picture from the accounts, and it is now, for the first time in 2,000 years, a physical object rather than an assumption. It had been repaired and repaired again with timber of 12 different kinds. That detail is the one that stays with people. A boat built mostly of cedar planking and oak frames, but patched over its working life with whatever was available: pine, sycamore, willow, hawthorn, and more. It was not a rich man's vessel. It was an old boat, kept alive by a family who could not afford a new one, mended until the mending itself became the structure. The recovery itself is worth a moment because it was done under pressure. Word of the find spread quickly. The water was expected to rise again, and there were people on the shore who assumed a 2,000-year-old boat must contain treasure. The excavation ran day and night for a little over a week, with a team working in mud, sprinkling the timbers constantly so that the wood never dried and cracked while they uncovered it. Then the conservation, which took years rather than days. Waterlogged ancient wood cannot simply be dried. The water is holding the collapsed cell walls apart, and removing it makes the whole object shrink and fracture into splinters. So the hull was immersed in a heated bath of synthetic wax, in a concentration raised slowly over a long period, until the wax had entered the wood and taken the place of the water. Only then could it be brought into the air. The boat that visitors see today is, in a real sense, a wooden object held in shape by chemistry. Whatever boat crossed the lake that night was something like this: low in the water, open, rowed. No keel to speak of, because a lake boat working close inshore does not want one. Steered with an oar at the stern, and in a chopping cross-sea, extremely hard work. Now go back to the evening before, because the crossing does not begin with the storm. It begins with a decision that the accounts are oddly insistent about. They had spent the day in a remote place on the northeastern side of the lake, where an enormous crowd had gathered, and where the crowd had been fed. What happened next is stated in different words by different writers, but with the same underlying urgency. The crowd wanted to take him and make him a king, and he would not have it, and he removed himself and his companions from the situation immediately. It is worth understanding why a crowd wanting to crown someone was a crisis rather than a compliment. Galilee was occupied territory under a client ruler, in a province where Rome had put down more than one popular movement within living memory. A large crowd in a remote place, hungry, excited, and talking about a king, was precisely the shape of thing that got villages burned. There was nothing sentimental about the danger. It was the ordinary arithmetic of an occupied country. There was a second reason, and it runs deeper than politics. John notes that Passover was near, and Passover is the feast of bread and deliverance, the memory of a people fed in the wilderness on the way out of slavery. A crowd fed with bread in a wilderness at Passover by a man from Galilee would reach for exactly one conclusion. Here is the new Moses, and he will do it again, and this time the empire is Rome. The feeding had been read correctly as a sign, and then immediately misread as a manifesto. So the crowd wanted a bread king, and the disciples had spent the afternoon distributing the bread. Whatever they thought was beginning that day, they were inside it rather than watching it. That is worth holding on to when the same men are terrified on the water a few hours later. They had not come from a quiet day. He made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead. That is the phrasing, and it is stronger in the Greek than it sounds in English. It carries the sense of compelling them, of overriding an objection. They did not want to go without him. They went because they were made to go. Then he went up the hillside alone to pray, and the crowd dispersed, and the light went, and out on the water 12 men began the ordinary business of rowing home. The wind was against them. That is Mark's whole explanation, and it is sufficient. Cold air off the heights, falling into the basin, driving down the length of the lake against the direction they needed to travel. In a boat like that one, with oars and no keel and a shallow draft, a headwind is not merely slow, it is a wall. Every stroke has to overcome the wind's push on the hull and on the men themselves, and between strokes, the boat gives back most of what the stroke gained. John gives the distance rather than the hour. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea. Different writers notice different things, and the two details fit together exactly. There is a small geographical detail that fits so quietly it is easy to walk past. They set out towards one place on the north shore and came ashore at another. A crew rowing hard against a wind that is not quite head-on does not travel in a straight line. It is pushed sideways all night, losing ground it cannot see itself losing, and arrives somewhere along the coast rather than at the door it aimed for. The account simply records the two names without remarking on the difference, which is what people do when they are describing something that happened rather than constructing something that ought to happen. 3 or 4 miles put them near the middle. On a lake 8 miles across at its widest, and rather less across the stretch they were crossing, 3 or 4 miles of progress is the deepest part of the journey, the point at which you are as far from where you started as from where you are going, with the lights of both shores visible, and neither of them any use to you. 9 hours of rowing had brought them halfway. That is the arithmetic of the 4th watch, and it is worth sitting with rather than reading past. A crossing that took 2 hours on an ordinary night had consumed the entire night, and they were not yet across. Consider what 9 hours of that is. Not 9 hours of effort towards a goal that is visibly approaching, which is bearable. 9 hours of maximum effort producing almost nothing, the shore not getting closer, the wind not dropping, the man beside you as spent as you are, and no reason at all to believe that the 10th hour will be different from the 9th. That is a specific kind of exhaustion, and anybody who has ever worked at something that would not move will recognize it immediately. Peter had worked this water since he was a boy. So had Andrew and James and John. These were not frightened amateurs caught out by conditions they did not understand. They knew the lake's moods better than they knew almost anything, and their skill was not enough, and that is the point the hour is making. The fourth watch is the hour at which competence has been exhausted. Something else is happening in the account at exactly this point, and it is easy to miss because it sounds like a stray remark. There is a phrase in Mark that most translations keep, though it puzzles readers when they notice it. He meant to pass by them. He came towards them across the water, and the text says he intended to go past. Read as ordinary narrative that makes very little sense. Why come out to them in order to walk past? The answer is that the phrase is not ordinary narrative. It is a quotation, in effect, a deliberate echo of language that anybody raised on the Hebrew scriptures would recognize instantly. When God reveals himself to Moses on the mountain, Moses is put in the cleft of the rock, and the glory passes by. When Elijah stands at the mouth of the cave, the Lord passes by. Passing by is what God does when he shows himself. Not a collision, not an arrival, but a presence that moves past a person who could not survive standing in front of it. Look at the two scenes it echoes, and the pattern is unmistakable. On the mountain, Moses asks to see the glory, and is told that no one may see it and live. So he is placed in a cleft of rock and covered while it passes by, and shown only what remains after. At the cave, Elijah, exhausted, frightened, and convinced he is the last one left, is told to stand on the mountain because the Lord is about to pass by. And the wind and the earthquake and the fire come first, and God is in none of them. And afterwards there is a sound like thin silence. Both scenes involve a person at the end of their endurance. Both involve wind and water and mountain. And in both, the technical word for what God does is the word Mark chooses on the lake. To a reader who knew those passages the way people once knew them, meaning to pass by was not a puzzling detail about walking routes. It was a signal, as clear as a chord change. The book of Job says something that would have been in their bones. He alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. That is not a poetic flourish about a powerful person. In the language and imagery of the Hebrew scriptures, the sea is the realm of chaos and threat, the thing that is not ordered and cannot be commanded, and walking upon it is a description reserved for God alone. So when Mark writes that he came to them walking on the sea, and that he meant to pass by, he is not straining for a miracle. He is saying, in the plainest terms his readers would have understood, exactly what he thinks is walking towards that boat. And they were terrified. All the accounts agree on this, and none of them apologize for it. They thought it was a ghost, and they cried out. 12 exhausted men, 9 hours into a night that would not end, saw something on the water that should not have been there, and reacted the way human beings react. And then he speaks, and the words are very short. Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. That middle phrase is doing more work than it appears to. In Greek, it is ego eimi, I am, which is the ordinary way of saying it is me, and is also, unmistakably, the name given at the burning bush. It functions on both levels at once, and both levels are true at the same time. It is the reassurance of a familiar voice, identifying itself in the dark, and it is the divine name spoken over deep water in the last watch of the night. There is a whole family of sentences in the Hebrew prophets built on the same two pieces: the declaration, "I am He," and the instruction, "Do not be afraid." They belong together, and they are said to people in exile, in trouble, or crossing water. "Fear not, for I have redeemed you. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you." The pairing on the lake is not an accident of phrasing. It is the oldest formula in the book, delivered in 3 seconds to men who were too tired to notice they had just been quoted at. And the order matters. Take heart comes first, before the identification and before the instruction. Whoever is speaking begins by addressing the state they are in, not by correcting their theology. The explanation of who this is arrives second, and the command not to be afraid arrives third, after there is a reason not to be. Notice what the words do not include. There is no explanation. There is no rebuke for their fear, and no answer to the obvious question of why they had been sent out into a headwind in the first place. 3 short phrases, 2 of which are about their fear, and 1 of which is about who is speaking. That is all. Mark wrote the earliest of the accounts, and his is the barest. He does not include Peter's attempt to walk out on the water. That is Matthew's, and it is a different kind of story with a different point. Mark gives you the hour, the wind, the passing by, the terror, the 3 phrases, and then the boat, and then the wind dropping. Matthew's addition is famous, and it is worth saying what it changes. In his account, Peter calls out, "If it is you, tell me to come to you on the water," and is told to come, and gets out of the boat and walks, and then sees the wind and begins to sink and is caught. It is a story about a man who does something extraordinary and then loses it halfway, which is why it has been preached on more than almost any other paragraph in the Gospels. Mark leaves it out entirely, and the omission is not a gap. Without Peter, the account is not about anybody's faith rising or failing. It is about who is walking towards the boat. The men in the hull do nothing in Mark's version except row, be frightened, and be spoken to, which, on a night like that one, is a fair description of everything they were capable of. And then a sentence that is stranger than the miracle. They were utterly astounded, Mark says, because they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. The previous afternoon, they had watched a crowd of thousands fed from almost nothing, and they had carried the leftovers away in baskets with their own hands, and it had not gone in. Not because they were foolish, but because that is not how understanding works. A thing can happen in front of you, and you can help with it, and still not have absorbed what it means until much later, often not until you are somewhere much harder. Which brings this back to the hour, and to why that small administrative detail about watches is worth an entire episode. The 4th watch is the last one. If help arrives in the first watch, the night has been interrupted. If it arrives in the 4th, the night has been endured. Everything that could be tried has been tried, and the arrival does not spare anybody the previous 9 hours. It comes after them at the end, when the strength is gone and the shore is still not there. That is not a comfortable pattern, and this account does not smooth it over. He was on the mountain while they were on the water. Mark even says he saw them straining at the oars, which raises the question every honest reader eventually asks. He saw, and he waited until the fourth watch. The text offers no defense of that and no explanation for it. It simply records the hour and lets the hour say what it says. There is a small mercy in the shape of it, though, and it is worth naming. He did not send them out and lose track of them. The straining at the oars was seen. Whatever else the delay was, it was not absence and it was not inattention. It was a delay under observation, which is a different thing from being forgotten in the dark. 2,000 years later, the boat sits in a climate-controlled room a short distance from the water it worked. You can stand in front of it. It is smaller than people expect and much more patched. The mended timbers are visible, 12 kinds of wood in one small hull, each patch a season when a family kept an old boat going for one more year because a new one was out of reach. It is not the boat from the account. Nobody serious claims it is. It is simply a boat of that lake, from that century of that size, worked by people of exactly that trade, and standing in front of it does something that reading cannot do. It makes the 8 meters real. It makes the low freeboard real. It makes it obvious how much water would be coming aboard in a short steep chop, and how heavy the oars would be by hour 9. It is worth saying plainly what the physical evidence can and cannot do, because that boundary matters, and it is often blurred. The mud of Ginesaw can tell you the size of a 1st century Galilean hull, the woods it was built and mended with, and how a crew of that period sat and rowed. Geology and meteorology can tell you why the wind falls on that lake the way it does, and how long a crossing should take when it does not. None of that establishes anything at all about what happened in the 4th watch. It establishes the room the account is set in, the dimensions, the temperature, the weight of the oars, and leaves the account itself exactly where it was. That is not a weakness. It is how any old report should be read. You check what can be checked. You find that the checkable parts hold together and fit the place, and you notice that a writer who was inventing freely had no reason to specify a shift number, a distance, or an inconvenient detour along the coast. Then the part that cannot be checked stands or falls on its own, in the open, without being propped up by things it never claimed. The details are not decorations on the story. They are the story, or at least the part of it we can weigh and measure. A trench in the earth filled with fresh water, cold air falling into a warm basin, a patched hull with no keel. 4 watches and a wind that held through 3 of them. Professionals doing everything correctly and getting halfway. What happened after they landed is almost comic in its ordinariness. They moored the boat and were recognized, and within a very short time, the whole district knew where they were, and people began carrying the sick into the marketplaces on mats so that they might touch even the edge of his cloak. No rest, no debrief about the night. The crew who had rowed until dawn stepped out of the boat into a working day, and the account moves straight on, because that is what the days were like. Nobody in the boat, as far as we are told, ever asked him why. There is no recorded conversation afterwards about the wind, or the hour, or the mountain. Whatever they understood it slowly and mostly later, which is the honest pattern of these accounts, and one of the reasons they read as memory rather than as design. If you are listening to this at night, there is a reasonable chance you are somewhere in the 3rd watch of something. Most of the difficult stretches in an ordinary life are not dramatic. They are simply long, and they are made of repeated effort that does not appear to be moving anything in the dark while other people are asleep. The account does not promise that the fourth watch will be short. It does not say the wind will stop before you are tired. What it says is that the hour is known, that it has a name and a number, that somebody has counted the watches, and that being seen straining at the oars is not the same as being alone on the water. And there is one more thing the hour gives you, which only shows up if you sit with the timekeeping rather than the drama. A watch ends. That is the whole nature of a watch. It is a defined shift, with a beginning and an end, kept by somebody whose job is to stand through it. The night on that lake was not endless. It was 4 watches long, and the 4th one was the last one, and it was already running when he came. The wind dropped when he came into the boat, not before. After the whole night, after the terror, after the 3 short phrases, and after he was actually aboard. Then the water went flat, and the last of the crossing was easy, and they came to the shore at Gennesaret in the early light, with the lake behind them looking, as it always does by morning, like nothing had happened at all. Sleep well, the watches are being kept.